You can't park that moving truck here. I'm calling the cops right now." That was the very first thing my wife heard when she tried to move out of her HOA neighborhood, and I'll never forget the way her voice shook when she told me later over the phone. Imagine this: you've spent months being harassed, fined, and bullied by an HOA board that treats you like a tenant in their kingdom, and finally, you decide to leave. You're not asking for favors, you're not sneaking out in the middle of the night, you've rented a truck, you've packed your boxes, and you're ready to move on with your life. But instead of relief, the very moment the truck's wheels touched the curb outside her townhouse, here comes Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, storming across the street with that smug little clipboard she always carried, hands on her hips, like she's about to stop a bank robbery. Karen had been the nightmare of that community for years. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was the embodiment of every horror story you've ever heard about HOAs. She fined people for leaving Christmas lights up a day too long, for parking their cars a foot too close to the sidewalk, even for planting flowers she didn't approve of. She believed the HOA rules were law, and she was the sheriff. And that day, when my wife was finally freeing herself from that toxic place, Karen wasn't about to let her go without one last show of power. Community rules strictly forbid large trucks without advance notice, she barked, her finger jabbing toward the moving company logo on the side of the van. This truck is blocking the street, it's blocking the mailbox, and you haven't paid your fines. You're not going anywhere until this is resolved. My wife, exhausted from weeks of packing and months of petty harassment, tried to keep her cool. "Karen, I'm leaving. I've given notice, I'm no longer going to be part of this HOA, and I don't need your permission to move my things." But Karen wasn't listening. She wasn't interested in reason. She wanted control. She pulled out her phone, her lips pressed into that tight line of superiority, and with a dramatic sigh, she said, "Fine. If you won't comply, I'll just let the police handle this. Let's see how they like you violating community law." And right there, in the middle of a calm suburban street, with neighbors peeking from behind curtains and pretending not to stare, Karen dialed 911 as though my wife was a criminal in the act of committing a heist. Have you ever had someone call the cops on you just to flex their ego? Not because you were breaking the law, not because you were dangerous, but simply because they wanted to feel powerful? That's exactly what was happening. And here's the thing, when you're in that moment, when you hear the words, "I'm calling the cops," your heart jumps. Even when you know you've done nothing wrong, it's terrifying to have someone try to weaponize authority against you. My wife stood there, clutching a box in her arms, staring at Karen like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She thought about all the times she'd tried to reason with this woman, all the apologies she'd made just to keep the peace, all the ridiculous fines she had paid to avoid more drama. And now, on the very day she was escaping, Karen wanted to drag her down one last time. The moving crew, who had seen their fair share of neighborhood drama, stood awkwardly by the truck, whispering to each other. One of them leaned over and asked my wife, "Ma'am, is she serious? Is she really calling the cops?" "Yes," my wife said bitterly, "she's serious." It felt like hours, though it was only minutes, before the flashing lights of a patrol car appeared at the end of the street. And of course, Karen was ready. She practically sprinted toward the officers as soon as they stepped out, waving her clipboard like it was a badge. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, breathless with fake concern. "This woman is trying to leave the community without resolving her outstanding HOA violations. She's illegally blocking the street with this massive truck, she hasn't paid her dues, and she's creating a public safety hazard. I demand you remove this truck immediately and prevent her from leaving until the HOA board has cleared her account." Now imagine being a police officer, showing up to what you think might be an emergency, and being greeted with that. The officers glanced at each other, then at the moving truck, which was parked neatly along the curb without blocking anything, and then at my wife, who looked more like a tired tenant than a criminal. "Ma'am," one of the officers said to Karen carefully, "what exactly is the crime here?" Karen blinked, as though no one had ever dared to question her. The crime, she snapped, is that she's breaking community law. She owes us money. She can't leave until she pays. You need to enforce this. The officer shook his head. That sounds like a civil issue, not a criminal one. We can't stop someone from moving out of their home. That's not our job. Karen's face turned red. But, you don't understand. I'm the HOA president. I'm telling you this is illegal. Meanwhile, my wife finally set down her box and stepped forward. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who worked in the federal court system every day and knew the difference between threats and actual law. Officers, she said, I've already given my notice. I've followed my lease. This truck is legally parked. What she's talking about is an HOA disagreement, and it's not your jurisdiction. I just want to finish moving my belongings and go. The officers looked relieved. That's fine with us, one of them said. You can keep moving. There's no reason for us to intervene here. Karen's jaw practically hit the pavement. She sputtered, waving her clipboard in the air like a sword. You can't just let her leave. She has unpaid fines. You're officers of the law. But the police weren't interested. They nodded politely to my wife, gave Karen a look that said enough already, and drove off, leaving Karen standing in the street, red-faced and fuming. For a moment, there was silence. My wife picked up her box again, her hands shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally seeing Karen's power crumble. The moving crew smirked, one of them whispering, "Guess she didn't get the answer she wanted." Karen stomped back toward her house, muttering threats under her breath about lawsuits, unpaid dues, and how this wasn't over. But in that moment, my wife knew she had already won. For the first time in months, she felt free. She didn't know yet how far Karen would take her vendetta, or that a courtroom was in her future. All she knew was that the cops had come, the bluff had failed, and Karen was left fuming on the curb, powerless against someone who simply refused to bow down anymore. Have you ever had that moment when a bully finally realizes they can't control you? That's what this was. And for my wife, it was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. Karen wasn't the type to back down, and if you've ever dealt with someone like her, you know exactly what I mean. The kind of person who, when they lose, doesn't walk away quietly but instead doubles down, determined to win, no matter how unreasonable it makes them look. That night, after the police left and my wife kept moving boxes into the truck, Karen stood on her porch with her arms crossed, glaring like a guard dog. She called out, "This isn't over. You'll regret this." My wife ignored her, but deep down she knew this woman wasn't bluffing. And sure enough, within a week, a thick envelope showed up at her new address, a notice from the HOA claiming she owed thousands in unpaid fees and fines. They accused her of breaking community rules, about the color of her curtains, the size of her welcome mat, even about leaving the garbage cans visible for 5 minutes too long. It was absurd. Anyone else might have panicked at the sight of an official-looking letter threatening lawsuits and liens. After all, HOAs have a reputation for grinding people down with endless paperwork and threats until they just give in. But my wife wasn't just anyone. She was a federal court clerk. She had spent years working with judges, attorneys, and case files that could make or break people's lives. She understood how the system worked. She knew the difference between real authority and empty threats. And she knew that if Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one, but not the way she expected. The first thing my wife did was sit down at her desk, spread out the so-called violations, and examine them one by one. Most of them were laughably vague. Exterior decor not in harmony with community standards. Failure to comply with mailbox uniformity. My wife chuckled. Mailbox uniformity? They're really reaching here. She wasn't angry, she was almost amused. But she also knew how dangerous this could be if ignored. HOAs thrived on intimidation. They hoped people would see the legal jargon and panic. She wasn't going to let that happen. So she drafted a response, a formal letter citing federal consumer protection laws, fair debt collection practices, and a polite but firm request for documented proof of every single charge. She gave them 30 days to respond, warning that failure to provide evidence would result in a countersuit for harassment and unlawful collection. She didn't send it by regular mail. She filed it officially, with certified proof of delivery. She wanted them to know she wasn't playing games. Karen must have nearly choked when she read that letter. Instead of scaring my wife into paying, it triggered the next move in her playbook. The HOA's attorney sent another letter, this time dripping with condescension. Our client, the Homeowners Association, maintains full authority to enforce community standards and collect dues as deemed necessary. They demanded immediate payment and threatened to escalate to court. But what they didn't realize was that my wife was ready, more than ready. She filed a countersuit in federal court. She didn't just argue that the charges were invalid. She argued harassment, abuse of authority, and even malicious intent, using the 911 call as evidence of Karen's pattern of intimidation. She included body cam footage showing Karen ordering police to stop a perfectly legal move-out. She even attached signed statements from neighbors who had also felt bullied by the HOA but were too scared to speak up until now. The case was accepted. Suddenly, this wasn't just a neighborhood spat. This was a federal matter, with a federal judge assigned to hear it. And here's the twist Karen didn't see coming: my wife worked in that very courthouse. She wasn't going to some small claims hearing in a dusty backroom. She was walking into a courtroom she knew like the back of her hand, facing a judge she had worked alongside many times. Karen thought she was pulling my wife into her web. In reality, she had walked right into a trap of her own making. In the weeks leading up to the court date, Karen strutted around the neighborhood bragging that she was finally going to teach that woman a lesson. She told anyone who would listen that my wife was going to be forced to pay up, that the HOA always wins, that no one escapes their grip. She even sent out a smug newsletter to the community, warning residents about the consequences of non-compliance. But behind the scenes, cracks were showing. The HOA's lawyers struggled to gather real evidence. Most of the so-called fines were arbitrary, handwritten notes from Karen herself, with no timestamps, no photographs, no legitimate documentation. The moving truck complaint? Not even in the HOA's bylaws. The unpaid dues? Already settled with the landlord, since my wife was a renter, not an owner. Still, Karen refused to believe she could lose. She had bullied people for so long, she thought she was invincible. She told the board, judges side with HOAs. Trust me, she doesn't stand a chance. Meanwhile, my wife prepared her case like a professional. She didn't just want to win, she wanted to expose Karen's behavior for what it was. She compiled every piece of evidence, organized it neatly, and rehearsed her arguments. When I asked if she was nervous, she just smiled. Nervous? No. I've been waiting for this moment. She's going to regret ever dialing 911. The night before the hearing, Karen stood on her porch again, watching as my wife loaded the last of her boxes into our car. She called out one more time, her voice dripping with false confidence. Enjoy it while you can. Tomorrow, you'll be paying every penny you owe, and more. My wife didn't even look back. She simply said, "See you in court, Karen." And with that, the stage was set. On one side, a woman who thought neighborhood rules were more powerful than actual law. On the other, my wife, armed with truth, evidence, and the backing of a federal courtroom. Karen still believed she was untouchable, but in less than 24 hours, she was going to find out just how wrong she was. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave with arrogance, blind to the fact that every word and every action was only making things worse? That's what was happening here. Karen thought she was building her case, but in reality, she was handing my wife everything she needed to take her down. And when that courtroom door opened the next morning, the look on Karen's face said it all. She had no idea what she had walked into. The morning of the hearing, the federal courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm, lawyers in pressed suits rushing between rooms, clerks balancing stacks of files, security guards scanning IDs at the entrance. For most people, walking into such a place would be intimidating. The marble floors, the echo of footsteps, the sheer gravity of justice hanging in the air, it all has a way of making you feel small. But not my wife. This was her world, her workplace, the very building she walked into almost every day. And today, she wasn't just an observer. Today, she was stepping into the arena as a fighter. Karen, on the other hand, strutted in like she owned the place. She wore a sharp red blazer and clutched a leather binder stuffed with papers, her lawyer trailing just behind her. She looked around at the courtroom with narrowed eyes, as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. To Karen, this wasn't a courthouse. It was just another stage where she could play queen of the neighborhood. But the moment she locked eyes with the judge, a stern man with decades of experience, who also happened to know my wife personally from years of clerkship work, her confidence faltered just a little. Have you ever seen someone's mask slip for just a second? That flicker of doubt in their eyes when they realize they might not be as powerful as they think? That was Karen in that moment. The judge called the session to order. We are here today to address the matter between the Homeowners Association, represented by Ms. Karen and her counsel, and the defendant, Mrs. Lopez. My wife stood calmly, dressed professionally but simply, no flash, no arrogance. She introduced herself, her voice steady, respectful. Karen's lawyer wasted no time diving into accusations. He rattled off a list of alleged violations: improper garbage storage, unauthorized decorations, failure to comply with HOA standards, unpaid dues. He made it sound official, his voice booming, each charge stacked like bricks meant to build a wall around my wife. Karen sat with her chin high, nodding smugly at every word. But then it was my wife's turn. She didn't rush. She began by thanking the court for hearing the matter, then carefully laid out her response. She presented photographs, timestamps, receipts, evidence that every charge was fabricated or already resolved. For the alleged unpaid dues, she showed proof that the landlord had paid the HOA in full, making her responsibility non-existent. For the supposed unauthorized decorations, she held up a copy of the HOA's own bylaws, which made no mention of curtain colors or welcome mat sizes. For the garbage complaint, she provided video evidence showing the cans being taken in within minutes, completely compliant with city rules. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents, nodding occasionally. Karen's face grew tighter with each piece of evidence. But my wife wasn't finished. Then came the bombshell. She introduced the 911 body cam footage. The courtroom grew still as the video played, Karen standing outside, barking at the officers, demanding they stop the moving truck. The officer politely explaining there was no violation. Karen insisting, her voice sharp and controlling. And then, the moment Karen didn't want anyone to see, her telling the cops that my wife was defying HOA orders, and that they should remove her immediately. The video ended with the officers walking away, clearly unimpressed. My wife turned back to the judge. This wasn't just harassment, she said quietly. It was abuse of authority. My family was threatened, intimidated, and publicly shamed for simply moving out of a rental property. This was not about community standards. This was about control. Have you ever been in a room where the power suddenly shifts, where you can feel the tide turning against someone who thought they couldn't lose? That's exactly what happened. The judge turned to Karen's lawyer. Do you have anything to counter this evidence? The lawyer stammered, shuffled papers, muttered something about interpretation of bylaws. But it was weak. The judge wasn't buying it. Then the judge addressed Karen directly. Ms. Karen, as president of the HOA, were you aware that your bylaws do not authorize such actions? Karen straightened in her chair, her voice sharp. With respect, Your Honor, I was acting in the best interest of the community. We have standards, and when people don't follow them, it's my duty to enforce them. The judge's gaze hardened. Enforcing standards does not include calling law enforcement to interfere with a lawful move-out. Nor does it include inventing violations that have no basis in your bylaws. This court does not look kindly on misuse of authority. Karen's face flushed red. For the first time, her bravado cracked. She tried to interrupt, but the judge raised his hand. Enough. He turned back to my wife. Mrs. Lopez, your countersuit cites harassment and abuse of authority. Based on the evidence presented, I find those claims credible. The court will be reviewing damages and appropriate remedies. The room went silent. Karen sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, as though she couldn't process what she just heard. She had walked into that courtroom expecting to humiliate my wife, to make her pay thousands, to prove her dominance. Instead, she was now facing the possibility of being held personally liable for damages, financially, legally, and reputationally. My wife remained composed, but I could see the relief in her eyes. She wasn't just winning, she was reclaiming her dignity, proving that Karen's reign of terror over the neighborhood was nothing but smoke and mirrors. As the judge scheduled a follow-up hearing to determine damages, Karen finally snapped. She leaned across the table, hissing, "You think you've won? You'll regret this. Everyone regrets crossing me." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Ms. Karen, one more outburst like that and you will be held in contempt of court." The threat was real. Karen shrank back into her chair, but the hatred in her eyes was unmistakable. When court adjourned, people filed out, murmuring quietly. Even Karen's own lawyer avoided her gaze, clearly embarrassed by how poorly their case had gone. Outside the courtroom, a few neighbors who had come to watch approached my wife. One of them whispered, "Thank you. She's been terrorizing us for years. Maybe now someone will finally stop her." My wife smiled gently. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about fairness. Nobody should have to live in fear of their own neighborhood." Walking out of that courthouse, the sunlight felt different. Warmer. Lighter. My wife wasn't just free of Karen's grip, she had exposed her for what she really was. And Karen? For the first time, she wasn't the one in control. She was on the defensive, facing judgment not from her HOA board, but from a federal court. And here's the lesson that lingers: bullies often seem unstoppable until someone stands up to them with truth and courage. Karen built her power on fear and intimidation. But when confronted with evidence, law, and integrity, that power crumbled. Have you ever faced someone who tried to make you feel small, only to realize they were the weak one all along? That's what this moment was all about. The battle wasn't over yet, damages still had to be decided, but one thing was crystal clear: the queen of the HOA was about to learn that in a courtroom, arrogance means nothing and justice speaks louder than intimidation.